Aloha. And Tashidele to everyone this evening. I'm really happy to be here in San Francisco. I didn't have to shave my head like I would for a Buddhist audience. I didn't have to wear shoes like I would for an academic audience. And it's really comfortable to be here and just be WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. What did he say? Did he say good things? Well, he's very kind, and you can tell from his heart that he's really going well on the path. And I'm really happy to see so many old friends and new friends, and I hope that people will tell me when to stop. So I'd like to leave a lot of time, as much time as possible at the end for questions, in case whatever I say raises some questions for you. I think it'd be nice to have time to share together. I like to build a community of inquiry, and I would like to start out with some ideas and then see how we can build on it. The topic that Tse Chen Ling asked me to speak about was ethics. And ethics is not usually the most popular topic in the United States. It's right up there with death and suffering, and usually you don't have a very big turnout for talks on these subjects. So I really appreciate all of you who've come out tonight to listen to this topic. And I appreciate the organizers also for putting that topic on the agenda, which is very timely because, as we all know, the world is in a terrible ethical crisis. We're facing a crisis of ethics in the corporate world, in the political realm, in the environmental realm. Just about everywhere we look, a lot of the problems can be tied into questions of right and wrong, however we might define that. So I wanted to share a few thoughts about how the Buddhists approach the topic of ethics. Ethics basically means what ought I to do. It's about decision making. It's about deciding what is a good move, a good decision in a particular situation. The Buddhists have a lot to say about ethics. Ethics is really central to the Buddhist path. In a sense, it's the foundation for all of the Buddhist teachings. Ethics comes first when we talk about the three trainings that lead to enlightenment. Ethics is first, meditation is second, and wisdom is third. So ethics is really foundational for all Buddhist practices, especially for all higher Buddhist practices. It's also said to be essential for a happy life. I mean, the idea of Buddhism is how to achieve happiness for oneself and for others, both now and in the future. So it's pretty comprehensive. And according to the Buddhists, it's all tied into a worldview, a particular worldview that many of you are familiar with and some may be new to. Ethics is integrally tied into ideas about karma and rebirth. But it doesn't have to be. There's a famous Buddhist scholar, Richard Hayes, up in Montreal, now in New Mexico, and he says that Buddhism can go very well without believing in rebirth. It still helps people to live happier lives. It still helps to build happier societies, healthier individuals. And so we can also leave the rebirth idea aside if we wish. But traditionally, the whole Buddhist path has been framed within this cosmology, this whole worldview of repeated rebirth generated by karma. The whole system moves ahead according to the law of cause and effect. So the law of cause and effect is simply that wholesome actions give rise to future happiness, and unwholesome actions give rise to future unhappiness, unpleasant conditions. So if we wish to be happy, then it's to our benefit to do wholesome actions and to give up engaging in unwholesome actions. That's really the whole basic Buddhist shtick. And then they elaborate it from there. Yeah. So I wanted to throw out ideas on a bunch of different topics just to keep the thing rolling. Some of the ideas I asked my students to talk about when I gave this question last week, actually, said, describe the Buddhist approach to ethics. Why is ethical conduct considered the foundation of Buddhist practices? How do ethical precepts differ for lay people and for monastics? How does ethical conduct relate to human psychology and human happiness? What's the connection? And what role does ethics play in the Buddhist worldview? So, well, they did pretty well, actually. The psychology idea, they didn't get too far with, but that's a very deep topic because it entails understanding the Buddhist concept of consciousness, which is very subtle, and exactly how the imprints of our actions affect our future. It's a rather controversial topic, in fact. How does this law of cause and effect work? Okay, we can explain the scientific worldview, action-reaction. And we can test it, methodically and prove that a certain action gives rise to a certain calibrated reaction. But what the Buddha did was to take this theory to the psychological level. So he takes it to a new level and includes human beings in the picture, in the world picture. So that's how it ties in with the whole Buddhist cosmology. That if we engage in positive, wholesome actions, we get happy results both in this lifetime and in the future. And if we engage in unwholesome actions, similarly, we experience unhappiness in this lifetime and in the future. Part of this equation has to do with ethics, and part of the equation has to do with generosity, which would determine what rebirth we're going to get. The Lamas say, you don't have to do too much deep thinking about this. It's pretty clear. If we're ethical, we have a good chance to get a human rebirth. If we're generous, we have a good chance to be born in affluent conditions. So the fact that we're all humans here, I assume, would mean that in past lives we have engaged in ethical actions. And that has not only resulted in a human rebirth, which is very positive for spiritual growth. It's as a human that we actually have the best crack at spiritual evolution. But it has also sown seeds in our consciousness for creating more ethical actions. Actions that do not harm ourselves and others, actions that benefit self and others. Then the thing about generosity, which is the first of the 6 perfections, is that if we are generous people, then in our future lives we experience affluence or prosperity. We have enough to eat. We have a comfortable circumstance. And that's also important for spiritual development. It's really hard to practice the Dharma when you're hungry. You can't meditate on an empty stomach. Very difficult. So The way this theory plays out is that you want both. You want both a human rebirth and you want to be born in a prosperous situation, defined as having the requisites, a subsistence standard of living so that you can practice. You have time to think about what we're doing here. You have time, if you so wish, to meditate. You have means with which to practice generosity to others. So it's possible to evolve further in this process. So just generosity is not enough. Just ethics is not enough. We could be a very ethical person and be born as a human being, but we could be reborn as one of the majority of the world's population that's not going to have sufficient nutrition today. Not going to get enough to eat today. It's not going to have a subsistence standard of living. We could be very generous people, and we could get reborn into very affluent conditions, but we might be a cat. A cat in La Jolla or Beverly Hills or whatnot, but still a cat, right? Now, I love cats. Cats are very furry. I am very fond of animals of all kinds. But their intelligence is not quite up to standard because they don't have the access that human beings have to information. And, I mean, they're not able to do a lot of the practices. Lotus posture, prostrations, very difficult. So, actually, there's a famous elephant in Thailand that said to do prostrations to the Buddha, but that's an exception to the general rule. So, now, another central component of this picture in trying to do good deeds, both because it makes us happy now and because it's going to make us happy in the future, and ultimately, hopefully, liberation from all suffering, enlightenment, is this key factor of mindfulness. Mindfulness, yeah? We all want to be good, but we blow it. I don't think, very few people really set out to do bad deeds. Often it's a lapse of mindfulness, a lapse of awareness. My practice now is on the freeways. In Hawaii, nobody goes over 50. Everyone's just cruising, enjoy the scenery, eba, friendly. Somebody wants to get in, aloha spirit, But, excuse me, no offense intended, but in Southern California, wow, the way they drive. It's insane. And it makes you nervous, yeah? It can also make you furious. And so it's a real practice. It's a real test of, okay, so you meditated this morning, you got really peaceful and calm. Okay, let's test your practice. And as people zoom in and out and take your parking space and everything. So mindfulness is very important because in one moment's lapse of mindfulness on a Saturday night, how many people get killed in this country? In one lapse of mindfulness, we say things we later regret. We lose friends. One lapse of mindfulness. One lapse of mindfulness, we pick up something that's not ours. Mm-hmm. One lapse of mindfulness, we fall in love. Oops. Do I need to explain further? So, mindfulness is really important, and mindfulness practice is central to the Buddhist path, the cultivation of mindfulness. Something that would behoove everyone, whether you're a Buddhist or not. Hey, Buddhist is just a word. Again, no offense, but it's a name for a tradition, a path to enlightenment. But Buddhism doesn't have a monopoly on mindfulness. Buddhism doesn't have a monopoly on wholesome actions. Buddhism doesn't have a monopoly on loving kindness and compassion. It's got a really cool, systematic presentation of how to develop these things. But it's not the only show in town. So mindfulness practice is actually pretty generic, in my opinion. It's something that can be practiced by anyone. Humans, optimally. And it's really important for ethics because, well, it's very important that ethics goes hand in hand with mindfulness. Because you can very mindfully kill someone. You can very mindfully rob a 7-Eleven. You can very mindfully engage in all kinds of unbecoming actions. But they're not necessarily wholesome, right? So mindfulness needs to go hand in hand with ethical principles, and as I'm going to argue in a minute, also with compassion and loving kindness. Another really important factor in the Buddhist presentation is the idea of motivation. What's the motivation behind our actions? We can give $100 because we want name and fame. We can give $100 because we need a tax deduction. Or we can give $100 because we genuinely want to help people. There's a difference in the karmic consequence of these three actions. It's the same person, it's the same destination for the donation, it's the same amount, but the karmic consequences of these three actions will be very different. The first two will be contaminated, or said to be contaminated with our own desires, our own agendas. And whereas the third donation, which is from a place of genuine compassion, a place of genuinely wanting to help, will garner the best, the optimum good karma. So that's an important thing to remember too in all of this. What's the motivation behind our actions? And the Buddhists are very careful and would like to ask us to examine our motivation for doing things. And also to examine our mind and why we do the things that we do every day. How many of the things that we do every day are for the benefit of others? And how many of the things that we do are for our own benefit? So if we're really honest in examining the motivation behind our actions, it's quite an wake-up call, actually. And it's a really good process to go through because it helps to guide us to be more mindful of our actions and also the motivation behind our actions. So, I mean, while we're in this good karma thing, we might as well get as much good karma as we can. Now, some people think that it sounds like brownie points, and this is a big discussion in the Buddhist world. I mean, what is this whole concept? Are we doing virtue for virtue's own sake, or are we doing good actions because we want to accumulate merit? I think it's a metaphor. You know, it's a metaphor for our sort of karmic bank account. But it's not, if our motivation is pure, it's not just trying to get something out of it, right? It's not just eye on the prize sort of thing. It's moment to moment, and that's part of the mindfulness idea, is mindfully, moment to moment, living in the moment, doing the best we can with this precious moment. Now there's a double advantage to that, which is that we're really present. We're totally present. If our motivation is clear and we're really careful to try to do the best we can in any given situation, then we find that we're totally present. If we're giving that $100 to someone, or even $1, to a person with the pure motivation of wishing to benefit, we'll find her right there with that person. So that is a really positive extra benefit of the practice of ethics. Much of our lives we go through sleepwalking. You know, it's planning about what we're going to do next, what we're going to eat next, where we're going to go next, what we're going to get next, or mulling over the past, what we did right, what we did wrong, what we do better next time, what we do differently. And this constant chatter in the mind really separates us from what's really going on. So we find that we get to the end of our life and we haven't really lived at all. We've got a whole series of experiences, a bunch of ideas, possessions. We've accumulated a great deal on the material plane, but it's over. And what do we do with our lives? So the idea, and I think the Buddha was really clear about this, trying to get our own preconceptions, our own greed, our own hatred, our own ignorance out of the way. All the preconceptions of our minds, all that overlay of conceptualization that we impose on our experience, get it out of the way. And as Ram Dass used to say, be here now. Be here now, moment to moment. Mm-hmm. And you can do all the other stuff too, but doing it totally present, totally aware, totally mindful. And what it does is make life truly meaningful moment to moment, day to day. So you're really there. And you're there for the people around you as well. One of the biggest preconceptions that we overlay on our experience is our own expectations, our own desires, our own aversions. I want this, I don't want that. So we judge our experience according to how well it meets our expectations. What kind of life is that? As if we were the only person that mattered. But more importantly, we lose out because we haven't really been totally present in the moment. So that kind of practice in mindfulness and awareness is another core idea. The Buddhists give some guidelines on what constitutes ethical conduct. How do we guide our decisions? Yeah? Who's to determine what is a good decision or a bad decision in any given situation? Well, the Buddha laid out some general guidelines, which I personally have found to be very helpful. In this system, it's important to note that there is no arbitrator. There is no divine figure. There is no cosmic consciousness spelled out. There's no one dishing out the rewards or punishments. And that's something that's a bit different from some other ethical systems. In this system, it all comes back to the individual. The doer of the action is responsible for the action. So if you make a mistake, you can't fob it off on your parents or your partner or your, co-workers. Whatever actions we create, both wholesome and unwholesome, we own. We take responsibility for. So that's an important thing to realize. But again, how do we make those decisions? So the guidelines that the Buddha laid out fall into he talked about two general categories of actions. Some were considered sort of unethical naturally, applying to everyone. And then there was another category of ethical actions that were sort of formed or created. Natural ethics, it's not around natural law. It's more about conduct that is considered ethical or unethical for the general person on the street. Say, in general, in most human societies, killing of human beings is not acceptable. It's not considered a good action. So, stealing is not considered generally acceptable. Lying, running off with someone else's partner. These things in general are recognized by human society as being problematic, right? So the Buddha called these sort of naturally unethical actions. And then he talked about other kinds of natural ethics that were created, certain guidelines that you set out for your life. Say, you take a precept not to kill. Okay? You can take it for a day, or you can take it for a week or a month or a year or for your whole life. From now on, I'm not going to kill. And then you can be more specific. I'm not going to kill humans, or I'm not going to kill anything. And again, it's an individual choice. Everything in this path is a matter of individual responsibility. So there's a difference between making this kind of vow or commitment not to do something and just not doing it. Okay, normally we don't kill humans. I mean, under ordinary circumstances. But there's a difference between simply not having killed someone and taking a vow for the rest of one's life never to kill a human being. There's a certain power to it, right? There's a certain power to making a vow of not stealing or of not having sex. Okay, a lot of people are celibate by default for a given period of time or for life or whatever, but that's a different kind of celibacy than making a lifetime commitment to not have relationships for the rest of your life. So there's said to be some kind of special power to making that kind of a lifetime commitment. Or a lifetime commitment to stay with a particular partner, for example. That's another example of a vow concerning sexual conduct. So those are some of the ways. For lay people, generally the Buddha advised not to kill, not to steal, not to lie, not to commit sexual misconduct, and not to take intoxicants. And sexual misconduct is broadly defined as not harming anyone through one's sexual conduct. And then in certain texts, if you read the fine print, it gets really, pretty specific. So specific that you might as well just forget the whole thing. So sometimes people ask, well, why the precept about intoxicants? What's wrong with taking a little bit of wine or a few tokes off a joint, like now and again? And the reasoning behind this prescription, this precept, was that when we take drugs or alcohol, our mind becomes clouded. Our minds become confused or blurred, depending on how much you take. Yeah, and when our minds are not clear, sometimes we don't make good decisions. Sometimes we make decisions that we regret. So, and karma can be seen as a matter of regret too. A lot of our actions, but we'll get to that when we come to the psychology part, right? Why ethics is a good idea. So the precept on intoxicants, there's a Tibetan story that the Tibetans often tell. They talk about a monk, a very lovely monk, very good-looking monk, and one who was very careful about his precepts, his conduct. And he had all the usual Buddhist precepts of a monk. And one day he's walking in the forest, and he met a beautiful woman. And she was leading a goat, and she had a jug of wine in her hand. And she said, "Oh, Venerable Sir, please sleep with me." And she was very enticing. But the monk was very well trained, and he said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I cannot do that. I'm a monk." And she said, "Oh, but you must. You must either sleep with me, or kill this goat, or drink this wine, or I will commit suicide." And he fell for it. And he thought of the three, the least non-virtuous was to drink the wine. And in the end, he wound up doing all three. So that's the reasoning behind intoxicants. When we get into the precepts for the monks and nuns, there are tons. The basic 5 precepts for the lay people, and then additional precepts, which are pretty much an elaboration on the basic 5 precepts. They're ethical guidelines about not lying, not killing, not stealing, no sex. Instead of sexual misconduct, it's no sex. And no intoxicants, but also a lot of other precepts that have to do with living harmoniously in a community situation. Right? Because you have sometimes hundreds or thousands of monks living together, hundreds or thousands of nuns living together. So they need some kinds of guidelines so they can work it all out without friction. And then there are a bunch of other precepts that are designed to maintain harmonious relationships with the community, the lay community that feeds the monks and nuns. So some of them are quite humorous, about how you're not supposed to slurp when you eat, and you're not supposed to, swagger, and, you're not supposed to sort of try to get, someone donates something, you're not supposed to sort of angle for something better, and, all these kinds of things. And so really, it's all laid out. And they must have been pretty bawdy characters in those days. We think people were, ever so saintly 2,500 years ago, but read these precepts. Hey, you can't even have sex with an animal. Phew. So things were going on, and the Buddha had to make some suggestions there. So what generally would happen would be that some monk or a nun would do something outrageous, and then the lay people would come and complain to the Buddha. And they'd say, did you see that? They were down in the river goofing off in the water all day, and I'm slogging away in the fields while they're down, playing in the river. That was the only shower system going in those days. And then the Buddha would call the offender and, "Is it true? You've been playing around in the river all day?" "Oh, yes." They always admit their guilt, of course. "Oh, yes, it is true, Honorable Sir, I was playing around in the water all day." And, "Oh, it is not seemly, it is not wise. It is not acceptable that you should be playing around in the water all day. From now on, I prohibit the monks and nuns from playing around in the water all day." So, at the end of the day, as the texts have it, the monks had 250 some odd precepts. Yeah, pretty naughty, yeah? And so, of course, historians know that these precepts were created over a long period of history, and that they evolved over time. We have records of 16 different schools of Vinaya, as the monastic discipline is called. And yet, in the text, they always put these prescriptions in the mouth of the Buddha. So it's the Buddha that's said to lay down these guidelines, which gives them, of course, authority. and also means that everyone is united behind keeping this body of guidelines. So, as many of you know, the Buddha first collected his first friends that he'd gone off to seek the truth with, asked if they could become his followers, and he said, "Come here." And with that, they were instantaneously shaven-headed and robe-clad. And after that, hundreds of and thousands of young men joined the order. And as they made mistakes, then the precepts were created. And then, as the story goes, 5 years later, the Buddha's stepmother, who was his auntie, applied to join the order. She really wanted to join the Sangha. And after hesitating 3 times, the Buddha is said to have relented and allowed her to join with certain qualifications. And the nuns wound up with 350 some odd precepts. So historically, in Buddhist societies, the extra number of precepts has been used as evidence to say that women have more delusions. I mean, women must have more delusions because they have more precepts. So that's the urban legend, right, about nuns. And of course, then that gets sort of by association applied to all women, that women have more delusions, therefore they need more precepts. But my refutation of this argument is that, in fact, the women inherited the 250 some odd precepts that had already been created on the basis of certain monks' misbehavior. And only 100 extra got created, right, on the basis, to do the math, got created on the basis of nuns' misbehavior. And actually, it's mostly one nun, one very naughty nun. Yeah. Yeah, her name was Tulananda, and she was really wild. She was very smart, and she must have been very charismatic because she had lots of followers, and they were all naughty, you know. So they got into all kinds of mischief, and they had to make a bunch of extra rules for the nuns. But only 100 extra, right? But the nuns got stuck with the others as well. So now, of course, we're in the process. My sisters and I today, Sangye Khadro and I were talking about how do we apply these precepts in the present day? How do we interpret them? What do we do? What did they mean, actually? Some of the terminology is practically incomprehensible. Many societies didn't have nuns over the last 1,500 years or 1,000 years. So we have the texts, but we don't have no clue sometimes how these things were implemented, how the nuns actually lived. So we're trying to figure that out. Now, besides the idea of precepts, these training, rules of training, and actually the precepts, the shila, it's the way it's framed is, I will engage in the training to refrain from. So it is a process. In some interpretations, other people see it more as a fixed sort of ironclad sort of thing. And there are benefits to both ways of looking at it. In a way, it's really helpful to have these guidelines. People often ask me, how can you possibly live with 348 precepts? It must be so restrictive. You must not be able to have any fun. Having to watch all the time that you're going to break one of these precepts. But actually, I find it quite liberating. And in my life, personally, and coming from my background, I mean, I'm a 60s person. I grew up surfing in Malibu. I was doing drugs before most of you were probably born. But in the end, to me, it's been a real blessing to have these guidelines. Now when people come and say, oh, let's party, you know, or something, it's not an option. It's just not, it's just, it makes decision making quite simple. And I really, really appreciate it. So, but, everyone has to find their own path and find what's comfortable for them. But being a nun has turned out to be really, after many years of being extremely naughty, then now I find it really a blessing to have these precepts and this way of life. In addition to the precepts, the Buddha also laid out what he called the 10 virtuous actions. It's another way of looking at it. In India, they didn't have books as we do today, where you can just sort of go to the index and look up what you need to know and stuff. They had to memorize everything. So they were very fond of making lists because that helped them to remember the list. And today we've sort of lost this tradition of memorization. But I quite value that training in Dharamsala when we had to memorize, unfortunately in Tibetan, but we'd have to memorize these endless lists of items. But then, when it comes time to give a talk, you need those 10 virtuous actions, those 6 perfections, those 5 precepts, or whatnot. It's in the computer someplace, and it makes it much easier to sort of refer to. You can reference back to those main ideas. So they have this list of 10 non-virtuous actions, and of course the converse is the 10 virtuous actions. And they divide them into 3 categories: the 3 non-virtues of body, 4 non-virtues of speech, and 3 non-virtues of mind. So, again, coming at it from all different angles, but eventually there's a chance we get it when we look at it from different perspectives. So in this grid, you have the 3 non-virtues of body, which are killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct. And you have the 4 non-virtues of speech, which are lying, harsh speech, divisive speech, and idle gossip. We get into a lot of trouble with this mouth. Yeah, once there was said to be a practitioner who just taped it shut. Too much trouble. And also we waste so much energy with talking. I'm the worst offender. And when we speak, if we're not mindful, we can make some real blunders. And lying is one of them. When we lie, sometimes we think it's convenient. And later, we often find ourselves trapped in the lies. And sometimes they catch up to us. Is that embarrassing or what? And this is happening, as we see, on the highest levels of government. And harsh speech is also considered non-virtuous because it hurts other people's feelings and it makes them angry. In ancient India and in Tibet, apparently the worst things that you could call people were animal nicknames. It's quite sweet. You dog, you pig, you cow. That was like the worst name you could possibly call somebody. In our culture, we have other words that we use. In Tibetan society, they believe that if they call someone an animal nickname, they will be reborn as that animal 500 times. So sometimes I wonder, what about body parts? Oh, let's not go there. Then divisive speech, right? We go to one person and say, did you hear what she said about you? And you go to the other person and say, well, did you hear what he said about you? With the intent of splitting up their friendship. And that's considered to be non-virtuous, big time, to cause dissension between people. And the 4th precept, or the 4th guideline in terms of speech, is idle gossip. So you think, well, how can that be non-virtuous? But then when we think about it, often as we're running off at the mouth, we actually fall into one of the first three categories of either lying or harsh speech or divisive speech, unwittingly. Maybe we run out of things to say, and so we fall into those habit patterns. The three non-virtues of mind, because in the Buddhist system, actions are not only actions of body and speech, but also the mind. We create karma through our actions, through our thoughts. So that's a powerful thing too. Even wishing to kill someone, even wishing to have someone else's partner, sets up non-virtuous karma. So the three non-virtues of mind are malice, wishing ill to someone, covetousness or greed, wishing to have someone else's things, and what they call wrong views. This wrong views category is pretty much, the worst instance is two things are noted. One is saying that the law of cause and effect doesn't work. There's no such thing. There is no result of my actions. And second, denying that there is a way out of suffering, that there is the possibility of enlightenment and liberation. So, maybe that's just a way of enforcing some of the other ideas, but these kinds of guidelines for living I find very helpful. And you don't have to take them as a lifelong commitment, and you don't even have to take them in front of anyone. You can practice with them in everyday life by becoming aware of them. In some of these, sometimes, once I went to my advisor when I was doing my doctorate, and I wanted to do a dissertation on Buddhist ethics. Actually, I wanted to do a comparative study of Buddhist and feminist ethics. And my advisor, who's a world-renowned scholar, told me, Buddhism doesn't have any ethics, it just has a list of rules. And I was quite shocked. But of course I had to mask my astonishment, and because I wanted to get out of there within 10 years, I didn't fight it. But I think there's a lot more to Buddhist ethics than just a list of rules. And as I mentioned, some of these rules are really very helpful. And the ante gets upped for the monks and nuns. It's sort of, killing a human is a breach for a layperson who takes the precepts. But the monks and nuns also have a precept not to kill animals. And they even have a precept not to destroy plant life where living beings might live. So it means, and we have to filter our water so that we don't unknowingly harm living creatures. So everything becomes, one has to be even more mindful when keeping these precepts. That's the idea. And it raises a lot of questions about, of course, that one, you can see the environmental implications of some of the precepts when we talk about harmoniously living in the world. That if we look at the big picture, we're talking about the happiness not just of oneself, but the happiness of all living beings. Especially all sentient beings, all creatures with minds. And we can only see the animals and the humans, but there are other beings out there that are also included in this picture. It also raises a lot of questions about the spirit of the rules as opposed to the letter of the rules. And so that's sort of the process that the Western monastics are going through. How do we capture the spirit of the rules without throwing out the letter of the rules? How do we negotiate between these two? Now, next I wanted to talk about, any questions up to now? let's go on to the psychology behind this. How does this really affect the mind? How do our actions affect our mind? In many cases, lots of people have noted that, in fact, probably Buddhism qualifies more as a system of psychology than it does as a religion, because it's really about the mind. And the theory is that our actions proceed from our minds, generally. We get the idea to do something, and then we put it into action, right? So if we could understand this mind, if we could learn to control our minds, if we could transform our minds, we'd be much happier individuals. And the people around us would probably be a lot happier too. So the idea behind Buddhist ethics is this transformation of mind. Our mind and our actions work together. There are 5 sense consciousnesses as well as a mental consciousness in Buddhism. Awareness is not only mental. Awareness is also visual. It's audio. It's, smelling and tasting and touching. So the Buddhists never run into this mind-body problem that the Cartesians do. And a lot of Western philosophy, they've been grappling with this for the last several hundred years. But the Buddhists really didn't have that problem because consciousness always included all of the sense consciousnesses as well as the mental consciousness. So it's thought that if we could transform our minds, then we would engage in more beneficial actions. Actions that would be wiser, more compassionate. And if we engage in wiser, more compassionate, more skillful actions, then that's also going to result in happiness for us. So it works together. A lot of our actions proceed from the emotional afflictions in our minds. And the Buddha talked about greed, and talked about anger and hatred, and talked about ignorance as the main 3 poisons of the mind. And you also have pride, you also have jealousy. But the big ones are greed, anger, and ignorance. And a lot of the other delusions are derived from these central 3 delusions of the mind. But what the nature of consciousness is really important in this picture. For understanding the mind, we need to look into its nature. And that's what meditation is really about. We sit down and watch our mind. We observe our mind. And what we find out is that the mind is impermanent. It's hopping around all over the place. Our ideas are fleeting. Our moments of awareness are ephemeral. Normally we're not aware of it because we're thinking to where we're going to go after the talk or what we're going to do tomorrow or that application we have to get in or that new restaurant we have to try or whatnot. But when we sit down to meditate and take time to look inside, we start to understand the function of the mind, the nature of the mind. And we understand that there's a lot more going on than we're normally aware of. A whole lot more going on. They say that there are 64 moments of consciousness in the snap of a fingers. How can it be? But when you sit down to meditate, you start to understand, because all of the sound, the car noise, the chair rattling, all of the visuals, you've got the central visuals and all the peripherals. You've got smell, you've got taste, you've got tactile, you've got the feel of your clothes against your body, to say nothing of the itches and pains and aches and so forth. And then you've got all the mental noise, constant litany of thoughts, ideas, impressions, regrets, emotions. So all of this is going on so rapidly that normally we're not aware of it until we start to meditate. And then people usually say, oh, this meditation is really a drag. I never had these problems before. I've never had so many distractions in my life till I sat down to meditate. I never had all these aches and pains either, yeah? And it's true. We can sit and watch television for 2 hours. No more aches, no more pain, no more distractions. But the minute we sit down to meditate, wow, like waves of distractions coming. Well, that's very instructive. You don't have to be a Buddhist to do this stuff, to get in touch with the nature of the mind. The next thing you realize is how quickly it's changing. Okay, 64 moments of consciousness in a finger snap, and then one moment after the other, like a movie, going constantly by. All of this stuff going on, because everything is changing. We're changing constantly. We're not the same person we were when we walked in the store. Scientists will tell us every atom of our body is like whirling around and everything is shifting constantly. To say nothing of catapulting 60 miles an hour around the sun. That's all going on too, right? So all this stuff is going on, and very quickly. So meditation is the way of getting in touch with that. But the good news is that because the mind is changing, we can change the channel. We can transform our mind. We can change at any moment. If we have an impulse to say something nasty to the driver in front of us, or our partner, or our boss, we can, by getting in touch with that thought, we can change the channel. We can refrain from that non-virtuous activity, which is going to cause us a lot of trouble down the line. In some cases, yeah, often. So that's how Buddhist psychology is all tied in with ethics. So ethics, the practice of ethics, actually means that we have to worry less. We have to worry less about getting caught by the police, trapped in a lie, getting caught in a compromising situation with somebody else's partner, stealing, getting caught stealing, and so forth. So it really makes life easier and takes a lot of the anxiety out of life. It also takes away a lot of the regrets. We can't help it. When we do something, we often, that's unskillful. If we're in touch, we often regret those actions. And the more non-virtuous actions we do, the more regrets we have to carry around. Now, in the Buddhist view, this is not about guilt, because even our non-virtuous actions can, what they call, be purified. Sort of like outweighed by our virtuous actions. So even if we've done something unskillful, we can do a whole lot of skillful actions, and if not totally erase that unwholesome conduct, we can make it less powerful. None of the Asian languages that I'm familiar with has a word for guilt. Yeah? And so in this system, it's not about having to carry around this heavy burden of the mistakes we've made, because we've all made them. And not just in this lifetime either. If you accept this worldview of past and future lives, we've also done a lot of dastardly deeds in the past. So many that it's probably a good thing that until we get pretty highly evolved that we don't even have the ability to see into our past lives, because what we find might not be so pleasant. Right? Even looking at this lifetime, we've got enough. So the idea, and this was the spin that the Buddha put on the theory of cause and effect, the theory of karma, was that karma is not about simply reaping the results of your past actions. It's active. It's in the present moment. It's what you do now that's important. Because after all, we can't change what we did in the past. Past is past. And we cannot change that, but we can learn from it, and we can definitely change our future or change our karma, as young people are fond of saying. Yeah. The other reason that ethics, the way ethics ties into psychology is that it eliminates a lot of the dis-ease and discomfort that we feel when we do unskillful actions. So basically we want to replace some of these problematic patterns with positive patterns. Mindfulness and compassion and loving kindness and wisdom. The next thing I wanted to talk about was the application of ethics to a couple of spheres of life. So this is all the foundational stuff. This is what the Buddha had to say about ethics. And the next topic is, how do we apply these ideals to some real life problems? I'm particularly concerned with bioethics. How do we apply ethics in reproductive health decisions, in end-of-life issues, in topics like suicide, assisted suicide, cloning, genetic research, in vitro fertilization? What do the Buddhists have to say about all these issues? Well, clearly the Buddha didn't have anything to say about a lot of them because they didn't have the technology at that time. He did not recommend abortion and suicide because his basic principle was not killing, especially not killing humans. So he recommended better not. But things like cloning, he couldn't weigh in on that one. They simply didn't have the technology to clone. What would the Buddha say about cloning? Well, that's for us to sit around and theorize about, based on the principles that he taught. Would he make a distinction between therapeutic cloning and reproductive cloning? I think so. But he'd probably also weigh in on how many sentient beings have to be sacrificed in the process, because obviously a lot of testing has to be done before these technologies can be applied. My opinion is that the Buddha would be pro-life, pro-choice. And that given that that taking life is not a good idea, he would still leave the decisions up to individuals. That it's really our responsibility to make those decisions, and people should be free to make the decisions as they feel best. And we should have compassion for ourselves and our friends as they make those difficult decisions. The other area that I'm interested in is social ethics. You know, what is the Buddhist position on social justice, on gender justice, on economic justice? environmental justice. Well, I think this is a wide open field. I think that the Buddhists really need to get to work on these issues, frankly. Those who wish. Again, it's a personal choice. But I think the world is in such a mess that those who are interested, the faster we get working, the better. There are a lot of principles that the Buddha laid out that can help us in trying to resolve some of these issues. But the precise application of those principles is something I think we can evolve, that we need to evolve in relationship to our present circumstances. You know, the Buddha had to do with caste injustice. He had to deal with that. We have to deal with racial injustice. Does his approach translate? I mean, how can we apply? In some ways, the Buddhists have been very active in society, but they were quietly active. Most of the schools were actually run by the Buddhists, particularly the monastics in Asian societies, the orphanages, the counseling centers, the hospitals. All of this was done in the monasteries, traditionally. They didn't have secular institutions necessarily to take care of those things. And obviously, they ran a major free lunch program for the monks and nuns, right? And for the disenfranchised, too. The leftovers were shared with the poor. But I still think that the Buddhists could be a whole lot more organized. I mean, we're not very organized, yeah? And the Dalai Lama has often said that the Buddhists should get moving, and that we should take as our models the Christian, especially the Catholic monks and nuns in some of these efforts. So, personally, I've been working with women, and I know people who are working on different levels. Buddhist Peace Fellowship is one very active institution. Tse Chen Ling runs this fabulous prison project, and there are many efforts now to protest against nuclear arms and for peace and so forth. And personally, I think this is completely compatible and actually is entailed by the Buddhist ethics. If we really wish to avoid harm to living beings, and we really wish to benefit living beings, then prayer is really important, and meditation is really important, because, without those things, we cannot really be effective, maximally effective. But there's still a lot of actual work that we need to do, and can do, and personally, I feel we should do. The last thing I wanted to propose is an overarching ethics that we could call care ethics, or an ethics of compassion, or an ethics of loving kindness. And this would be both the backdrop or the foundations of a global ethic. But it would also be its logical extension. It would be its application. Especially as we go out to work in the world, that our actions be informed by wisdom, compassion, and loving kindness. Now, obviously, this is not my original idea, because His Holiness the Dalai Lama has been saying this for 50 years. But as I watch him work in the world, and I watch Thich Nhat Hanh work in the world, and Sulak Shivaraksha, and some of these, and Aryaratne in Sri Lanka, and Mother Teresa. Hey. It seems to me that people are really fully effective when loving kindness and compassion is at the heart of what they do. And if we can embody loving kindness and compassion in the world, that ethic in effect will take care of our day-to-day decision making. Now, wisdom is absolutely necessary in this process. When His Holiness and the Tibetan masters talk about the Bodhisattva path to enlightenment, they always talk about wisdom and compassion as being the two wings of the bird that flies to enlightenment. They usually go like that too. Right? So this wisdom, this insight to understand what is the most skillful action in this situation. And at the same time, from the compassion side, what is the most skillful means to accomplish that action? If our actions for the good of the world are informed by this kind of wisdom and compassion, then I think we've got a really good chance of turning things around. And no matter what happens, if we can't control it, the situations around us, we can respond to the situations in the most effective way. So that means, of course, we have to develop this loving kindness and compassion in our hearts. But the beauty of this path is that as you practice with it, it grows. Right? So it's a win-win situation. The more you give, the more love you have. And in a heart filled with loving kindness and compassion, there's no room for hatred. There's no room for anger. Because the heart's all filled up, yeah? So, it's, I think, a really happy way to live and a really beneficial way to live. So, that's just my experience. But, and I haven't embodied it yet. I'm still, moment to moment, working on it. And, but I can recommend it, yeah? From what I've seen. Shall we take just a few minutes for loving kindness meditation to wind up this series? So first check over the body from head to toe to make sure you're completely relaxed. And then check the mind too, to make sure the mind is completely relaxed. Put away all regrets about the past, anxieties about the future. Rest completely in the present moment. Now begin by generating loving kindness to yourself. Imagine your body and mind completely filled with loving kindness, compassion in the form of light. And then generate loving kindness to the person on your right. Imagine that person too, completely filled with the light of loving kindness and compassion. And then the person on your left, from head to toe, full of love, full of compassion. And then direct these same loving, compassionate thoughts to the person sitting in front of you. And the person sitting behind you. And then expanding out to include everyone in this room.